It's funny, I did a story, gosh, maybe 6-7 years ago about conjugal visits in the California prison system. And I went with a woman who was had married a guy while he was in prison.
I love those stories.
And I could tell it later if you want, but I tagged along on her first conjugal visit. And that was when California first introduced conjugal visits, like in the late 60s, early 70s.
A conjugal visit is where they can be alone together?
Yeah. Sometimes called the boneyard. They're family visits, sometimes known as F visits. When they were first introduced, and California was kind of the pioneer in this field, it was considered a way of allowing inmates to blow off steam and reducing sexual assault or, homosexual rape within the prison system, which seemed like actually a good idea. It was kind of, there were some like deep stereotypes and prejudices built into that, but it still seemed like a good result. And then as the, criminal justice system became more and more punitive, especially in the early 90s, they took away all of that from anybody who was serving time for murder. And they just, when I had done this story, they had just reinstituted conjugal visits for people doing life, which again makes sense. Give somebody something to lose. Give them something that's a reward. And so, yeah, I tagged along. I mean, it was super. I didn't go in, I couldn't go in with them, but I drove from her home with her to the prison gates, dropped her off, and then I stayed in a motel for 2 days, waiting.
How long were they?
It's 2 nights. 2 nights.
2 nights.
Basically, like 48 or 36 hours.
That doesn't sound like prison to me.
In a little apartment unit where they can order food and there's a kitchen and a TV.
It just sounds like a typical Saturday
It's actually
night.
pretty nice. And you get to do it 4 times a year. And as some people joked, that might be more action than some married couples have.
That's right.
But if you're the spouse going in for the first time, you can't go in with your phone. You can't go in with your stuff, right? You become confined. You become a prisoner for that time. And you're going to see the person you love, but you've never, certainly if it's the first time, you've never known them at that level before. There's a degree of sudden intimacy in a kind of unsettling environment.
Yeah. There's so many interesting subcultures and things like that here in Los Angeles. I'm sure New York has the same thing. So you were a writer with the LA Times.
I was. I'm now freelance. I'm an author and I write magazine articles that interest me. But I was with the LA Times for 15 years, from 1985 to 2000. And then I transitioned to Los Angeles Magazine, and I was on staff there from 2000 until 2009. But
with the LA Times, your specialty was what?
Did a lot of things over that time, but in the early 90s, I became the gang reporter for the LA Times. And I think I was probably the only full-time gang reporter at any major newspaper in America, which was, kind of a dubious honor, maybe. Well, it said something about how crazy things were in Los Angeles at that time.
Yeah, and I think they still are too, right?
They are, but it changes, as culture changes, the demographics, the social geography of LA changes.
That was the drive-by era.
Yeah, and I think that's not really happening in the same way. No, and I think the drug world has changed. I think fentanyl, which is, a terrible scourge, has a different reaction on people, and the fentanyl economy is a little different from the way the crack economy was.
Sure.
The crack economy was so hyper that unit price and the degree of how long that hit lasted was so low and so short that it created this manic cycle, and the gangs got involved in that, and it led to just horrific violence. I mean, and when I was covering gangs, I think at the pinnacle in probably 1993, there were over 800 gang-related murders in LA County and over 2,000 homicides in general. We're at like a quarter of that today. So even though people today are rightfully concerned about public safety and crime is a huge issue, and as is, homelessness and drug addiction, mental wellness, it is a lot safer in LA today than it was 25 or 30 years ago. I know people don't want to hear that, or I don't know if it brings comfort or not, but people come from LA from all over the world, and not everyone, whether they're coming from another country or internally within the US, they don't always have that institutional knowledge or that background. It all seems like the moment is the moment. And we're better off today.
The gangs in LA, when you were covering them, it was mainly the Bloods, Crips, Hoovers, and the Hispanic gangs?
Yeah, I would say so. I mean, the Bloods and Crips got all the headlines for a variety of reasons. They were especially active at that time. They were probably more involved in the crack economy than the Latino gangs were. They also, like the black narrative, the African-American narrative in America is just more familiar to mainstream audiences, right? We know to some degree the history of slavery in America and the Civil War and the Civil Rights Movement and the idea of Black Americans, grappling with poverty and fighting against structural barriers and, demanding, some degree of equity and a seat at the table. We kind of recognize that. And on top of that, Black culture is American culture, whether it's music or sports or fashion or what have you. I mean, and the gangs were good at that. The gangs were, inventing a lot of that stuff, or other commercial forces would take those ideas and co-opt them and make money off of what the gangs were doing organically. And the Latino gangs were probably at that time every bit as big and every bit as violent. But they, the perception is that they were more turf oriented. There was more about their neighborhood. I think there was some stereotypes baked into that as well. But they were, for all the reasons that I think immigrants today, Latinos today are trying to, are the subject of a tremendous amount of discrimination and victims of being stigmatized. They were more outsiders at that time. I think that it was harder for mainstream to understand. Some of it was cultural, some of it was language, and some of it was just kind of maybe a quieter, lower key approach to handling business.
What do you think the purpose of all the violence that these gangs, what are the purpose of LA gangs? Other cities have them too, but LA is probably the home of them.
I mean, for better or worse, mostly worse, gangs are like one of the most stable social institutions in Los Angeles. I mean, they persevere. Again, talking about memory and institutional knowledge. I mean, you have gangs more on the east side of LA that have been active for 100 years. I mean, that's incredible. Nothing lasts 100 years in LA. You have gangs. We're going to talk a little bit about my book in a moment, the Rent Collectors, which is about a gang in the MacArthur Park area.
Yeah, it's a fascinating story.
That was targeted twice by the federal government in back-to-back RICO cases in the early 2000s. And they're still around, they haven't gone anywhere. And so it raises a lot of questions about what do we do about this, or how do we coexist with gangs, because they're not vanishing. They fulfill too many needs. There's too many young people, mostly young men, who lack the hope and the self-image and a sense that their life matters and they have a future that counts. And the gang offers, a degree of belonging and acceptance. It offers an identity. It offers a form of organized power and control. I think if imagine you live in a neighborhood that the rest of LA says that's a war zone. You shouldn't step foot in that neighborhood. And you're a young guy growing up in that neighborhood. Well, you want to, you don't want to be a victim of that either. You want to show that you survived that war zone. You became part of the war authority in that neighborhood. You're not the victim of it. And it just satisfies too many real needs. It fills the void. It fills the vacuum in people's lives. In the case of the story I've written about in this book, the gang was a more stable structure than this kid had in his own home.
Do you want to tell that story, or just to give us a brief overview? Because it's a really compelling story.
Yeah, so my book, The Rent Collectors, is framed by two botched murders. And they take place, the first one takes place in the MacArthur Park neighborhood. And I feature...
Which is basically like an annex to Skid Row.
Well, yeah, if you put downtown in between
in the middle,
yeah,
then Skid Row Annex is MacArthur Park.
It's a mile west of downtown. To paint the picture, it's like one of the densest communities on the West Coast. You have about 100,000 people packed into 2.5 square miles. The large majority of them are immigrants. Many of them are undocumented. Many have fled war and oppression in Central America. And you have a gang there that is just particularly well organized, that has really adapted to the density around them and to the desperation around them, and have figured out how to take advantage of that vulnerability. And so they impose a tax, they charge rent to pretty much anyone in the neighborhood. So it doesn't matter whether you're selling drugs, or you're a gambler, or you're a sex worker, or you're selling fake ID. Everyone has to break off a piece, pay rent to the gang. And my story involves the rent that was being charged to the street vendors. There's thousands of street vendors in that neighborhood, most of whom came here to work, but are barred from the formal workforce because they don't have papers. And so they're doing like a very classically American thing, a real entrepreneurial capitalist view of the world. They're going to make something with their own hands. They're going to make tamales at home and bring them out on the street, or they're going to make a stew, or they're going to go to a discount store and buy diapers or batteries or socks in bulk and then sell them piecemeal. And it takes some guts. It takes some chutzpah to do that and take it out onto the curb and say, this is how I'm going to make a living, knowing that you are not just vulnerable to the gang charging you rent, but you're vulnerable to the LAPD. Things have changed since the time frame of this book, which is mostly around 2007. But at that time, street vending was illegal of every kind. There was no permit you could get. There was no license you could get. Being out on the street selling a taco was a violation of the municipal code and, punishable by up to 6 months in jail and $1,000 fine, which is insane, I think, So much of, when you think of LA and you think of our culture here, you think of street food, you can't live in LA and not have like your favorite taco stand, whether it's a truck or a place with bare bulbs hanging over on a street corner. We are like the greatest taco city in the world. And anyway, you just have people trying to survive, They're improvising because they have faced these structural barriers at every other turn. And so, for those folks, they're being hounded by the police and they're being taxed by the gang. And so they're really caught in the middle. And the book is also from their perspective, from the perspective of those street vendors. And you had a vendor, this is in 2007, who decides he's just not going to pay his tax anymore. just tells the gang, screw you. You know, the streets, they belong to everybody. And the gang responded by saying, you know, this is not a game. You got to pay or you have to leave. And he refused. And I think of him, his name's Francisco. Like, it took so much courage. It took gigantic balls to stand there and say, who are you to be charging me anything?
Because
these
gangs are very, very violent.
Yeah, I mean, you're playing a lethal game at that point. And at one point, they challenged him. They came and shoved him, and he pulled a knife on them. He's like, you know, back off, motherfuckers. You know, I'm holding my ground. And again, like, he's a proud man and a courageous man, and also kind of naive and more too stubborn for his own good. And he picked a fight with the wrong people. And the gang now needed to send a message to Francisco and to all the other vendors who are watching this. You know, what is the price of failing to comply? But of course, the older, savvier members of the gang, they don't want to go out and, you know, dirty their hands over a little 2-bit, you know, mission like this. Francisco owed them like $50. I'm sure Francisco didn't think that there was going to be the death penalty associated with that. But the gang, again, guys who are in their early 30s, who are running things and organizing all those taxation schemes, and we can get into this in a moment, but also paying their money up to a higher authority, to the prison gangs, to the Mexican mafia. So they're both implementing a taxation scheme, but they're also the subjects of a taxation scheme. They need somebody to go out there and do the dirty work. And they choose a kid named Giovanni Macedo, who's somebody I've come to know very well over the last 6-7 years. And we're very close. We have a close relationship. I visit him every single month in prison. Giovanni was young and naive and angry and confused about his place in his family. He inherited a lot of real dysfunction. He lost his biological father to AIDS when he was 1.5 years old and didn't know that. It was kept secret from him. He had a stepfather who stepped in as a provider, but was also just a terrible drinker and added a lot of violence and volatility into their home. His mom was, you know, stretched very thin and struggling with her own mental wellness. And it was a very chaotic home. And the gang, especially these older male figures in the gang, represented something to Giovanni that he didn't have at home. You know, there was order, there was power, there was, to some degree, accountability. I mean, these guys were, you know, on top of stuff. At home, nobody was really on top of stuff. It was chaotic. And they chose Giovanni for this terrible mission.
How old was he?
Giovanni was 18. He had just turned 18. And he was kind of like, he wasn't a very accomplished gangster. You know, he had been in the gang for a couple years, but he'd been in and out of juvenile hall and probation camps, hadn't really spent much time on the streets, and he kept getting busted for ticky-tack little stuff. And I think the gang kind of was trolling him. They had this image that he was a snitch, and, you know, they kept needling him over that. You should do something, you know, prove to us that you're really down for the hood. And I have no reason to believe any of that was true, but they used it, and it was like they were libeling him, and he had to figure out some way to get this image off of him and rehabilitate himself in the eyes of the gang. And so they summoned him out to 6th Street, a couple blocks east of Alvarado, on a Saturday night, 2007, and they put a gun in his hands and they tell him, "You're going to go handle this for us." Giovanni did not wake up that day wanting to kill somebody. I think he really had no desire to kill anybody. there was no rage here, right? This person had not wronged him. This is not a rival gang member of any kind. It's just like a cold, clinical mission. Go out and kill so we can maintain our economic scheme that we have going on. And I guess that appealed to me. I mean, once I learned about all this as a storyteller, I appreciated the fact that this was about money and not about just some kind of blind fury. And it was an economic scheme that the city of LA, in a lot of ways, was complicit in because of our laws and the way we criminalize street vending. We sort of hung the vendors out to dry. Anyway, Giovanni goes out there and he does what he's supposed to do, which is a terrible thing. But it also takes, it takes courage. It takes mettle. It takes guts. He walked up to Francisco. I should add that Giovanni didn't even know who Francisco was. He wasn't part of this taxation business. He was kind of too low on the totem pole. And so he needed somebody to go with him and point out who Francisco was. He needed to make sure he was shooting the right guy. And they found somebody who was also like a rent collector who walked him down 6th Street and said, that's him. And so Giovanni now, with that information, goes up to Francisco and from closer than you and I are right here, aims a gun and gets off 5 shots. Boom, 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 boom. And 4 of them hit Francisco and gravely wound him. The one bit of good news here is that Francisco survived. Francisco is alive today and functional. I just visited him at Thanksgiving time, brought him an apple pie for his family. So I'm pleased that he didn't die, and I think Giovanni is pleased that he didn't die. But the real tragedy is one of those bullets struck a newborn infant in a stroller right next to Francisco, a 3-week-old baby named Luis Angel Garcia. And why was that baby out there? Because his mother was a vendor. She had just given birth. And anyone who had the resources to care for their child, to take time off of work or to have a family member or child care, whatever it may be, would be protecting that kid. But Luis Angel's mother didn't have any of that. She didn't have any safety net. She didn't have anyone to help her. And so, at this incredibly young age, her child is now out on the street with her in the midst of super crowded sidewalk with all sorts of commotion and food and exhaust and cash. And it's not where you would put your 23-day-old little boy. And Giovanni never saw the baby, didn't know that a bullet had struck the child, didn't know that the baby had died, until 2 days later. He's turning on the news, and he sees the mayor of Los Angeles at that time announcing a reward, $75,000 for information, leading to the arrest of this monster who had killed an infant in the MacArthur Park area. And at that moment, Giovanni realizes, like, holy shit, I am that person. He thought he had succeeded. He thought he had redeemed himself. He was now in good standing. And in fact, he's discovering that he's committed this atrocity. He's done the worst thing he could possibly ever dream of doing. And at that moment, he is just overcome with emotion. He breaks down in tears and is realizing, he's going to have to live with this for the rest of his life. What he doesn't understand are the implications of killing a baby. He knows it's terrible, but he's so naive about the way the gang world works and about his gang's relationship with the Mexican mafia and what the repercussions are for killing a baby, which is it's essentially a war crime. Gangs will embrace and endorse all kinds of mayhem that is part of the way they see their world operating or their business operating, the things they have to do to maintain control of a neighborhood or their drug revenues or their identity or whatever it may be. You do that stuff because it's part of the game, but you don't ever kill a baby. And 2 days after this happened, 3 days after this happened, they pick up Giovanni and say, we're going to Mexico. And he's naive enough that he thinks that they're going to hide him out, lay low for a while, and that when the heat dies down, he'll be able to return to MacArthur Park, and it'll be business as normal, and he will have ascended in the organization. But in fact, they're taking him to Mexico to kill him. And they go down to Tijuana, a group of 4 of them, all members of the same gang. This is the 18th Street gang. And they check into a motel in TJ, and they kind of throw him a bachelor party, like the bachelor party he'll never have. And they get him drunk, and they go to some striptease clubs, and he's trying to have sex with a prostitute, and it's just like a big, sloppy, messy night. And in the middle of that night, with Giovanni completely wasted and maybe their conscience sort of assuaged that they've, they don't really, he's still a homie, right? They're doing a dirty deed here. They throw him in the car and they drive on this windy mountain road between Tijuana and Mexicali. It's called La Rumorosa. And it's this, goes through some crazy rock formations. It parallels the U.S. border. And it's a scene of all sorts of accidents and ghost stories. And it's the place where you would dump a body if you had like sort of a cinematic view of what you were trying to accomplish. And in the middle of the night, they pull over. 2 of his own homies throw a rope around his neck. They're in the back seat. He's in the front. And they yank. And they yank and they yank. And he's struggling and his feet are kicking the dashboard, and they've pretty much pulled his neck into the back seat, and blood's pouring out of his nose until they hear him, what they think is his neck snapping and his body going limp. And at that point, they drag him out of the car and they heave him over the edge of this cliff. And they drive back to LA, and they report that they have, in their mind, taken out the trash. Had they not done this, the consequences, it's called a green light. It would be open season on that gang. And, anyone from a rival gang could just go into the neighborhood and blast on that neighborhood, anyone there or in the jails or the prisons. It was just like carte blanche, do what you will, because this gang has screwed it up so badly. But once they cleaned up their mess and got rid of Giovanni, it was back to business as normal. And incredibly, this is the too crazy to believe part of the story. Giovanni wakes up on the side of that cliff, and his neck is all torn up and he's covered in blood and vomit, but he's basically okay. They haven't really done any internal damage. And he's able to crawl up the side of this gorge and get himself to the road. And I'm obsessed with that moment, because what do you do? Like, who are you at that moment, right? Like
and where do you go?
Yeah. You've done the worst thing probably any of us could ever dream of doing. You have now been betrayed and disposed of by the very people whose approval you were seeking. And now everyone thinks you're dead. You're kind of lost, but you're also home free in a strange way. Maybe somebody with more resources would, go down Baja and become a fisherman on the Sea of Cortez or something and hit reset and go, holy shit, I'm alive and I never want to think about anything that happened before. Giovanni was a kid. He had no phone. He had no ID. He had no money. He had no shoes. They had taken those as they were heaving him over the edge. And he hitched a ride with a truck driver down into Mexicali. And the driver dropped him off near an OXXO store, these convenience marts that are everywhere. And he goes in there and he looks like a zombie. You know, his eyes are completely bloodshot from the pressure and the asphyxiation, and his neck is like raw hamburger. And, I think anyone else would probably call the police, or call an ambulance or something. And the cashier there, saw something for him in him, felt something for him, saw that he was in trouble, and allowed him to use the phone. And he ended up calling his mom, who he had a very strained relationship with at that time. And she drove down. She was in the Antelope Valley area of Los Angeles, north of central LA. And she has to navigate in the middle of the night all the way down to Mexicali, and picks him up. And now he's got to figure out what to do, what next. And he ends up going into hiding in Utah with his girlfriend. They know somebody who was living there. And Giovanni ends up working for a slaughterhouse. He's carving up cow carcasses for several weeks in the winter of 2007. But is having this kind of beautiful suburban life. It was like it came too late for him. He had like stability there, and he was making a decent paycheck, and there were snow-capped mountains around them, and the air was fresh, and there was no other gangs to bump into. And it was like, damn, like why couldn't he have found this earlier? But eventually he became aware, the LAPD became aware that he was alive. They had assumed he was dead. And they end up on the phone together, and he agrees to turn himself in.
How did they find out?
A gang officer went to Giovanni's girlfriend's home, and her sister, who had been half asleep on the couch and maybe wasn't thinking through the repercussions, says they tried to kill Giovanni. And that's the first time the LAPD thinks, oh, he's alive. So they hadn't heard a peep about him in weeks. And, they left a phone number for him to call. And word gets to Giovanni in Utah, and suddenly, alarm bells are going off, and Giovanni realizes he's lost the element of surprise. He's no longer invisible. He's on their radar. They actually didn't know where he was, and he probably could have, extended his time on the lam for longer. But his conscience was getting to him, and the police had raided his mom's house in that time, and she had to kind of cover for him and say, I don't know where my son is. And he didn't want her or anyone else to kind of take the fall for his misdeeds. So he agreed to turn himself in, and that same night, LAPD was at his door, ready to take him into custody. And there's a moment in the book that just always touches my heart, and I think it tells you something about who Giovanni was at that time in his life. The detective calls him out. Giovanni walks up to him, and the detective says, put your arms up, and he's gonna, frisk him, touch him for weapons. And as he's doing that, Giovanni turns towards the detective and puts his arms around him, and he's hugging him with tears in his eyes. The guy that's taking him into custody, but he's a male figure, he's an authority figure. He's somebody that traveled all the way to Utah to find Giovanni. And I think Giovanni just felt that relief and that the depth of caring for him, even though the consequences were going to be disastrous. And that same night, he confessed to the whole crime. No lawyer present. When I eventually had a chance to talk to Giovanni about this, I was like, wanted to grab him by his shirt and say, don't you watch TV? Don't you see the movies? I need a lawyer. And on one hand, it screwed him over because he had no leverage. He'd sort of given away everything. And at the same time, by turning himself in and agreeing to cooperate, he bought himself a second chance. And he ended up testifying against his former gang in 3 different trials. And there's something about that, too, that really captivated me. I mean, here's a kid who literally rises from the dead to haunt his former homies. And, he was the star witness in these cases that put away dozens of members of his own gang. And in return for his cooperation, he got a 51-year prison sentence, which seemed just unbelievably brutal for somebody who was manipulated by these older, savvier people and who were the big fish that the LAPD and, frankly, the FBI were after. They wanted the guys who sent Giovanni out on the street. But those guys were smarter and got attorneys. And, the shot caller for the gang ended up negotiating a deal for 24 years in federal prison. And it always seemed incredibly unjust to me that the heavyweight guy got less than half the time that Giovanni got. So I was living in this neighborhood. I had an apartment in MacArthur Park. Everything that I've been describing was basically outside my windows. I looked out on the park itself.
You lived in the middle of it?
For 10 years.
Wow.
And the crime had already occurred when I moved in, but the trials hadn't. So I'm reading about this case. I'm hearing about Giovanni's testimony about him, again, the perpetrator of one botched murder, the survivor of a second botched murder. And I'm looking out at this ecosystem that had led him astray. And I see, the cops, LAPD squad cars rolling through the park and the ghetto birds flying at night, floodlights coming through my window. I see gamblers, rolling dice out on the park. I would see dead bodies washing up from the lake. And I would get to know the vendors, the guy who made fresh orange juice at the corner of 7th and Alvarado, and the lady who sold socks at 6th and Alvarado. And I began to soak up that world and realize, like, this is a book. It's a crime story. For sure, but it's about more than a crime. It's about kind of the microcosm of LA at its most complicated and its most precarious. And in a world that I think we kind of all have an obligation to look at and try to understand. And it's so easy to turn your head or even pretend that it's not there. I would look out at the park, the lake, these streets where all this is happening, and there's the skyline right behind it. All the steel and smoke glass skyscrapers where the law firms and the accounting firms and the movers and shakers of LA are, and this is happening like a mile away from them, and nobody knows. Like it's just not part of their reality. And so I decided that this is an incredible story, but also like a personal story to me. About my experience in LA and the product of decades of writing about gangs in the lead up to that. And so I decided to write Giovanni a letter. I didn't have any connection to him. It was really a shot in the dark, and he could have easily told me to go screw myself. And he had been incarcerated for 11 years at that time. This was 2018. And, prison's a terrible place. And you don't know what it's going to do to somebody, how broken he might have been or how corrupted he might have become in that world. And as it turned out, my desire to know about him and what I told him in that letter is that I imagined he was not the same person anymore who pulled the trigger in 2007. That desire to know who the real person was or who the person was that he had become or was becoming was matched by Giovanni's desire, his obsession, his need to tell the world that he's not that guy. He was that guy. He did that thing, but that doesn't define him. And he really, he wanted he wanted people to know that he wasn't a monster, even if he did a monstrous thing. And he felt that if another young person could learn from his mistakes and see what he discovered, that, the gang as his family, as his identity, as his avenue to belonging, that it was kind of an illusion. And that family turned on him the minute things got tough. He told me, he wrote me a letter that brought tears to my eyes. And he says, if somebody can avoid making my own mistakes, then my life is an open book. And that began a relationship with in-person visits and correspondence back and forth. And now that inmates have tablets in the California prison system, we can, message each other by text, and we can do video calls, which we usually do every weekend. I became deeper and deeper, more deeply involved in his life. And to the extent that there's something worthwhile to be gained from reading The Rent Collectors, I really owe it to Giovanni, because it took incredible courage and integrity to open up his life the way he did. There's a lot of things that are not flattering. There's a lot of things that are really painful in his life, and some things that he didn't even fully understand, and that we learned together, as I'm asking probing questions and as I'm going deeper in my reporting, which included traveling to Mexico to see where his biological father is buried, and traveling to El Salvador to see where his mother grew up, and the house that she left when she was smuggled north as a little girl, and to then Guatemala, where his stepfather had been deported to. And, you start to see all these threads of his life coming together, and these larger global forces that all led up to this one moment. It gave him clarity, I think, in terms of understanding who he is and what he wants to become. I should add that due to some, I think, really meaningful sentencing reforms in the passed by the California legislature, there's a recognition that when young people commit crimes, their brains aren't fully formed, and they're more susceptible to peer pressure, and they're not as culpable as a result. And even though he did something that he needs to be held accountable for, and Giovanni would be the first to admit that, he's not anybody who's saying I'm innocent or I don't deserve to be in prison. He knows he has to pay that price. But at the same time, how long? When does he cease becoming a risk? And under these new rules, he's entitled to a parole review in his 15th year of incarceration. And without giving too much away from the end of the book, I can say that he hasn't had that parole review yet, because he wants to put his best foot forward. He really wants to show that he's doing the work, the school work. He's taking community college classes. He got his GED in the time that I've known him. He's got labor, real work in the prison system, and he's taking all the self-help classes that you can imagine. He wants to go in front of that board and say, truly, I'm not the same person anymore. As I've gotten to know him and seen his growth, and had really deep conversations with him about kind of owning up to what he did, but also forgiving himself for what he did, and making him more aware of who his victims were, because he didn't know, and since he never stood trial, he was a cooperator. So he never faced his victims ever again. So this vendor, Francisco, Giovanni saw him for 3 seconds 17 years ago, and that's it. And so, I've had to illuminate him more on all of that, and help him understand what he took away from Francisco and from the baby. and at the same time cheer him on when he's doing the good work. And it's kind of, I mean, we shouldn't be surprised, but when he would call me up and say, he calls me Tio, by the way, Tio. Actually, he calls me Tio Gatos, because of Katz as my last name. Tio Gatos. Hey, I got 100% on this test, and I would feel this kind of swell in my chest, and I would say, I am so proud of you. You're doing great work.
Have you become like a father figure to him?
In some ways, yeah. I mean, there really hasn't been a male figure in his life who can play that role. But I say something like that to him, and then I catch myself and I think, how many times did he hear that growing up? I have a son who's a couple years younger than Giovanni, and he's probably heard me say, I'm proud of you so many times that he takes it for granted. And you ask yourself, gosh, if Giovanni had just heard that a little bit more, if somebody was able to encourage him and see the goodness in him and nurture that and reward that, like, I feel like it didn't have to be this way. And I guess that underlies a lot of the storytelling I do. And I think it's kind of what motivates a lot of your work too.
It's exactly what motivates a lot of my work.
It's this. We face like really painful situations, and we talk to people who are, have all this like internalized anger and rage and confusion, and are often medicating their pain or acting out, wanting to hurt other people because they've experienced that hurt. And I think in all of that is you want to believe, first of all, that those people have a way out, that nobody is beyond repair. Well, there's a couple people in my book who just need to be locked up forever, but Giovanni's not one of them. And, we all, once you see people as real human beings and, know their name and their face and, you see their humanity. They're not a category. It's not gang member, or it's not felon, or it's not whatever. It's Giovanni, and that empathy, I think, is really healing for everybody. But it also taps into this idea, like, it just doesn't have to be this way. Like, nobody is destined to grow up to be a gang member, Nobody is destined to grow up to pull the trigger in a terrible crime. It's just a lot of things that conspire against them. And
as a teenager,
yeah, also our brains do develop, and a lot of people grow out of violent crime for sure. So there's always this hope of kind of a redemptive possibility.
Yeah, I just interviewed a couple former members of the Mexican Mafia, and they both are so reformed, so incredibly reformed now that you would trust them with everything there is to trust somebody with.
I know both of those guys. I've interviewed both of those guys. Mundo Mendoza, I talked to maybe 30 years ago in the aftermath of the movie American Me, the Edward James Olmos movie, and 3 people associated with that film were killed. And Edward James Olmos was the target now of threats from the Mexican Mafia. And he needed to talk to somebody, what do I make of this? How do I protect myself? How serious is this? And somebody connected him to Mundo, and they had lunch together, and Mundo very graciously shared with me what that was like, talking to Eddie at a really difficult moment in his life. And then, Rene Enriquez, boxer, is in my book. He's somebody who sheds light on how the Mexican Mafia operates and who the godfather is, who is overseeing all this stuff in MacArthur Park. I just want to add that it's so crazy that everything that was happening out on the streets, Giovanni shooting Francisco, was ultimately to serve the interests of a guy named Puppet, who was doing life at Supermax in Florence, Colorado. This guy is 1,000 miles away in the most intense, dehumanizing, secure facility that the U.S. government can devise. This is it. El Chapo's there, the shoe bomber's there, the Unabomber used to be there, Puppet's there, and yet Puppet, from practically solitary confinement, is orchestrating these rent collections out on the streets of MacArthur Park. And I mean, it's terrible, and it's also like, you just go, wow, at the same time. There's a certain kind of evil genius, a dark imagination that can't be confined. And you think about the talent, and you saw it with Rene, Boxer Enriquez, the level of like charisma and wisdom and eloquence, and like these are people that would be successful in so many other environments.
Oh yeah, you could see him as a politician, as a lawyer, as a doctor, as anything.
Absolutely. It also, it takes a lot of smarts to rise to the top of an organization like that. I think I was talking to somebody recently who read my book and said she liked it, but then said, I'm not the audience for your book. Your book is aimed at the young person who's at risk of becoming the next Giovanni. And I said, I disagree. I think you think this isn't your world. You think this doesn't apply to you, but it does. Like, we're all connected to this, and your ability to see Giovanni's humanity, your ability to see the ways that LA might be complicit, whether it's through neglect or through policies or through oppressive techniques that fomented all of this stuff. And so, yeah, I mean, that's the bottom line of everything, is that, there really is no us and them, and these lines that separate us, and especially in a city like LA where there's all kinds of boundaries, right? We have very elite, affluent areas that erect fences and gates and say, keep away from here. And then we have poor, distressed communities, and we're told, keep away, don't go in there, it's not safe to go in there. And it's like, how did we get this way? We're all in this together.
Yeah, we are. Yeah, we're all part of the same. We're all the same person, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's hard. It's challenging. My book asks you to feel Francisco's pain as a victim of violent crime, and have your heart break for a 23-day-old infant who never had a chance, and at the same time feel something for the person who did that damage. And can you hold those two feelings in your head or in your heart at the same time? It's not easy.
No. All right. Jesse Katz, thank you so much for sharing a bit of your book, and as well as some of your other stories.
Awesome to be with you, Mark.
Thank you very much. Even though Soft White Underbelly consists of a lot of videos, it's really still a photography project to me. And if you appreciate the photography, sometimes it's difficult to enjoy it when it's scrolling down the screen, which is the only option I had in this horizontal format on YouTube. So last year we came out with the first Soft White Underbelly book, which is a collection of the best portraits from the thousands of interviews I've done. Each portrait in this book is accompanied by an interesting quote from the person's interview.
Oh my God.
There's more.
Wow. These aren't as bad as I thought. I look like a witch.
I will not be reprinting this book when it sells out. So once it's gone for good. You can order yours at softwhiteunderbelly.org. $125, $150 for a signed copy. And thank you for watching.